Juan Domingo Perón was overthrown in 1955 in a bloody military coup. Perón fled into exile, and Argentina was once again placed under military rule. The middle class celebrated Perón's downfall as a victory for democracy and the country's deliverance from the rule of a tyrant. And many of them joined the military in its campaign to erase all symbols of the fallen Peronist government. But for Perón's mostly working class supporters, the 1955 coup was a tragedy and a betrayal of the most pro-worker government that Argentina had ever seen. They still thought of Perón as a popular hero, but this coup was about much more than their loyalty to one man. With a right-wing military dictatorship back in power, everything that the labor movement had gained over the last 12 years was now under threat. Labor rights were being rolled back, union contracts were being ignored outright by management, Peronist labor leaders were being imprisoned, while their rank and file was being harassed by anti-Peronist overseers who were now looking to settle some old scores. In the eyes of much of the working class, this coup wasn't about freedom or democracy. It was about beating the working class back down into a position of subservience. While the 1955 coup was a major setback for the Peronists, they still had a couple of assets that might help them in fighting back against this reaction. They had the numbers, they had their fond memories of the overthrown government, which offered them a clear and unifying vision of what they were now fighting to restore, and most importantly of all, they still controlled most of the labor movement. During the immediate aftermath of the coup, the Socialist Party launched a campaign to reorient the labor movement away from the Peronists. But this campaign was complicated by the Socialists' intimate involvement in the 1955 coup. The Socialists were hoping to convince the workers that their interests lay with socialism rather than with Peronism. But this was a very tough sell for a socialist party that was openly supporting a right-wing military dictatorship that was actively rolling back labor rights. Instead of placing the labor movement under socialist control, this attempt to reorient the CGT away from the Peronists only ends up splitting the CGT into two parts. The Socialists and the Radicals control 32 of the mostly white-collar unions who were never very Peronist to begin with, while the Peronists retain control over a labor group called the 62 Organizations, which consists of most of the country's large industrial unions. The foundation of the 62 organizations under Peronist leadership is a major victory for the Peronists for two reasons. First, it is a moral victory that demonstrates that the bulk of the labor movement is still on their side, even though their government has now been overthrown. And second, the 62 organizations are a key organizational asset that the Peronists might use to stage a comeback. While the Peronist Party is now banned, the 62 organizations is a completely legal Peronist organization that is able to operate above ground. And this gives the Peronists a much wider range of options than are typically available to an outlawed political party. The Peronists consider three basic strategies for overthrowing this reactionary regime and bringing Perón back to power in Argentina. First, they can launch a campaign of armed revolutionary struggle that relies on pro-Perón factions of the military and the Peronists' still very deep mass support among the working class. Second, they can use the 62 organizations to carry out economic disruptions such as strikes and sabotage. And third, they can pursue the kingmaker strategy that Peru's opera used in the 40s and 50s. And they can use their large base of mass support as leverage in negotiations with other parties that might be willing to re-legalize Peronism. In the immediate aftermath of the coup, the Peronists focused on a strategy of armed resistance. From exile, Perón appoints John William Cook to be his personal representative in Argentina. Cook is a well-respected leader of Peronism's left wing, and he initiates the process of reorganizing Peronism as a revolutionary movement. However, the initial clashes with the military government go extremely poorly for the Peronist rebels, and most of the Peronists involved are executed in 1956. The Peronists will return to armed resistance later on, but at least for the time being, revolutionary struggle is largely off the table following the 1956 debacle. So what about resistance through non-violent labor action? After 1956, the unions become the primary site of Peronist resistance, and Peronist workers carry out a series of strikes and boycotts, while others carry out acts of economic sabotage at the workplace. However, much of this labor activity is focused on very narrow goals, such as defending previous gains like the internal commissions in the factories. Labor resistance is widespread throughout the late 50s, but it is also disjointed and uncoordinated, and much of it is occurring at the level of the individual factory. And this raises the question of why the Peronists did not use their control over the 62 organizations to carry out a more coordinated campaign of economic disruptions aimed at bringing down the military regime and restoring Perón to power. Part of the reason was that such a campaign probably would not have worked on its own, because as a general rule, general strikes do not topple military regimes in Latin America. But an even more important reason was that the leaders of the 62 organizations were not especially interested in even trying. And at this point, we need to talk about the incentive structure of labor politics in Argentina at this time. Union leaders are elected by their membership, but once they are in office, it is extremely difficult for a Peronist labor leader to lose subsequent union elections in Argentina in the 50s and 60s. Union leaders have a variety of legal and illegal tools at their disposal to buy off the right members and beat back any internal challenges within their union. Instead of being voted out of office by the membership, the most common way that a union leader loses their job in post-1955 Argentina is by being removed from office through an intervention by the military government. The risk of being ousted by the military tends to make Peronist union leaders more conservative than their rank-and-file members. Union leadership positions were extremely lucrative at this time, and the union leaders thus had a lot more to lose if their union engaged in acts of labor militancy that challenged the current regime directly. The man who best exemplifies this pragmatic conservatism among the union leadership is Augusto Timoteo Bandor, who leads the powerful Metal Workers Union. After being imprisoned by the military dictatorship following the 1955 coup, Bandor regains control over his union in the late 50s, and he works to reorient it away from direct confrontations with the military regime in favor of less antagonistic bread and butter unionism. Bandor has political goals, but his preferred means of achieving them is not through strikes, but rather by pursuing the third strategy available to the Peronists, which is based on influencing the course of Argentine politics indirectly through negotiations with other parties and by playing the role of kingmaker once Argentina begins holding elections again in 1958. Around the time that Perón was overthrown, the main non-Peronist party, the Radical Civic Union or UCR, split apart once again into two separate party organizations. The People's UCR, which is the most staunchly anti-Peronist of the two, and the Intransigent UCR, which is not exactly pro-Peronist, but is at least open to the idea of re-legalizing the Peronist party. Importantly, these two offshoots of the UCR are of roughly equal size, so the Peronists can have a significant impact on the election result if they can coordinate their vote on one of these two options. The Peronists helped get the intransigent radical leader Arturo Frondizi elected president in 1958, with the implicit understanding that Frondizi will lift the proscription on the Peronist party. Frondizi puts this off throughout most of his presidency, but he finally relaxes the proscription for the 1962 legislative elections. The Peronists do a bit too well in these elections, and they win around half of the seats that are up for re-election, along with 5 governorships. The Peronist victory is not acceptable to the conservative factions of the military, and President Frondizi attempts to appease the military by annulling the Peronist electoral victories retroactively. However, this is not enough to save Frondizi's presidency, and the military removes him from office in another coup later that month. The downfall of Frondizi provides a good illustration of why this chapter of Argentine political history has become known as el juego imposible, or the impossible game. The two halves of the UCR face unreconcilable pressures from the Peronists who want their party re-legalized, and from the military who wants Peronism to remain banned. You cannot form a stable government without the support of the Peronists, who are still a majority of the population. But you cannot get the Peronist support without promising to re-legalize their party. But if you do re-legalize the Peronist party, then you are going to get overthrown by the military, which is still playing an active role in Argentine politics despite the ostensible return to civilian rule. This would seem to be a no-win scenario. But the Peronist labor leader Augusto Bandor thinks that he has a solution. He argues that the problem isn't the Peronist party, but Perón the person. And the military might be willing to accept Peronism if Perón were no longer in the picture. And so the solution to the impossible game is to build a Peronism without Perón. Bandor sets out to build a new political party called the Popular Union, which aims to be Peronist enough to get the support of Perón's supporters, but also distant enough from Perón personally that it will be allowed to compete in elections. But there is a major problem with Bandor's strategy. Perón did not authorize it, and he views this as a usurpation of his movement by Bandor. Perón appoints a new personal representative, his third wife, Isabel Perón. Isabel travels to Argentina where she publicly chastises Bandor. She tries to orchestrate a split within the 62 organizations, and she sabotages Bandor's electoral efforts by backing rival candidate slates that are designed to split the Peronist vote. Meanwhile, a new president called Arturo Illia has been elected in 1963. Although Illia comes from the more anti-Peronist wing of the UCR, he agrees to let Bandor's party and other so-called neo-Peronist parties compete in the 1965 legislative elections. The new Peronists once again win just under half of the seats that are up for re-election. Illia does not immediately annul this election result like Frondizi did, and the military does not immediately overthrow Illia like it did with Frondizi. So at least Argentina is making some progress. However, Illia gets overthrown by the military for entirely different reasons just over a year later. This 1966 coup brings to an end the highly constrained pseudo-democracy that Argentina had maintained since 1958, and it inaugurates a much more repressive military regime that attempts to reorganize Argentine society from the top down without bothering with the pretense of holding elections or letting civilians occupy the presidency. This turn of events discredits Bandor and his pragmatic and electoralist wing of the Peronist labor movement. The 62 organizations experienced several splits during the late 60s, including the formation of a more radical labor organization called the CGT de los Argentinos, which is led by an alliance of leftist Peronist labor leaders who prefer a much more combative and antagonistic strategy and non-Peronist Marxists who are willing to work with the Peronists for the purpose of overthrowing this new military dictatorship. The labor movement's shift to the left reflects a radicalization of Argentine society as a whole during the late 60s. The Cuban Revolution had an important demonstration effect for leftist movements throughout Latin America, but it has an especially big impact on the Argentine left since El Che was originally from Argentina. Ernesto Guevara was never a Peronist back when he lived in Argentina, but after the Cuban Revolution, he meets with Perón in exile several times to discuss forming an alliance. While these meetings ultimately come to nothing, left-wing Peronists interpret them as proof of the inherent compatibility of Peronism and Che's adaptation of Marxist-Leninism known as Guevarismo. While some of the tenets of Marxist-Leninism are hard to reconcile with Peronism, the Peronists generally have a much easier time digesting a second strain of Latin American socialism called liberation theology, which is a region-wide movement that seeks to reorient the Catholic Church to the left by combining Christian theology with Marxist analysis. Many left-wing Peronists quickly recognize significant points of overlap between the new liberation theology and the old Peronist ideology of the 40s and 50s. After all, Peronism had been based on Christian humanism, a concern for social justice, and an implicit recognition of class conflict. And for many on the Peronist left, liberation theology seems like the logical conclusion of Peronism. Moreover, one of the central figures in the Argentine branch of the liberation theology movement is a Peronist priest named Carlos Mujica, who was one of the founders of the organization Priests of the Third World. For Mujica, the main implication of liberation theology was that priests and lay activists should carry out sustained but non-violent organizing work in the shanty towns or villas miserias. But there is a second, more violent strain of liberation theology associated with the Colombian priest and later guerrilla fighter Camilo Torres, who declared that it is the duty of every Christian to be a revolutionary and to participate in revolutionary struggle. While Camilo Torres' revolutionary brand of liberation theology is rejected by Mujica, it nevertheless becomes very popular among the Argentine Christian leftist youth of the 60s, including among several of Mujica's followers. During the late 60s, Peronism, Guevarismo, and liberation theology all come together into a new revolutionary current within the Peronist movement that seeks to carry out a social revolution through urban guerrilla struggle. In the early 70s, most of these Peronist guerrilla groups merged into the left-wing Peronist guerrilla movement, the Montoneros. One of the Montoneros' major allies is the Peronist youth, which is a bit more ideologically moderate than the Montoneros, but which has been trending towards the left since the late 60s. The radicalization of the Peronist youth reflects an important shift in the predominantly middle-class students' movement around this time. The middle-class students had been bitter opponents of the Peronist government in the 40s and 50s, but their children in the late 60s and early 70s have come to see the Peronist youth as a natural space for left-wing militancy and activism. In 1969, this new middle-class leftist student current of Peronism joins forces with Peronism's much older working-class laborist current to carry out a major popular insurrection in the city of Cordoba known as the Cordobazo. Although this uprising is ultimately crushed by the military, it sows divisions within the military regime, and it also galvanizes the growing insurrectionary currents in both the labor movement and the students' movement. In the aftermath of the Cordobazo, the Peronist guerrilla movements step up their operations and they carry out a campaign of targeted bombings, kidnappings of foreign businessmen, bank robberies, and assassinations. They target not only the members of the current military regime, but also conservative Peronist labor leaders like Augusto Bandor, who was assassinated in 1969 by a Peronist guerrilla group called the Revolutionary National Army. Although these labor leaders are fellow Peronists, the Peronist revolutionary tendency views them as a corrupt labor bureaucracy that has sold out Peronism by collaborating with the military and Peronism's other enemies. However, by far the highest profile victim of the revolutionary tendency is General Aramburu, who is kidnapped by the Montoneros and then assassinated after being convicted by a so-called revolutionary tribunal. Although Aramburu is not part of the current military regime that is in power at this time, he was a leading organizer of the 1955 coup that overthrew Perón, and he became the main public face of the military dictatorship of the late 50s. Aramburu's assassination triggers a crisis within the current military dictatorship. A week later, the hardline leader of the dictatorship is forced out of the presidency, and his successors initiate the process of extricating the military from power and returning the government to elected civilian leaders. By this point, the anti-Peronists have tried highly constrained pseudo-democracy, and they have also tried outright military dictatorship, and neither regime was able to restore order. And no leader since Perón has managed to survive in office for more than 4 years. Many of Perón's former enemies are reluctantly coming to the conclusion that Perón may be the only man capable of leading a stable government in Argentina. The military is not quite ready to let Perón return yet, but the outgoing military regime does allow Perón's new personal representative, Héctor Cámpora, to run as a presidential candidate in the 1973 election. Cámpora is strongly associated with the leftist current within Peronism, but he works to unite the broader Peronist movement behind him by explicitly running on the return of Perón to power. His campaign slogan is Cámpora al gobierno, Perón al poder. In other words, the way to get Perón back into power is by voting for me, Héctor Cámpora, as president. Cámpora's main opponent in the 1973 election is Ricardo Balbín, who is the leader of the anti-Peronist People's Radical Civics Union. Cámpora gets just under half of the vote, while Balbín wins around 20%. The military allows Cámpora to assume power, and he is inaugurated as president on May 25, 1973, with the Chilean socialist president Salvador Allende and the Cuban communist president Osvaldo Dorticós in attendance. Once in office, Cámpora lifts Perón's exile, and he immediately resigns the presidency, calling for a new presidential election later that year, in which Perón will finally be one of the candidates. And so at long last, it finally happens. Juan Domingo Perón returns to Argentina. But alas, there would be no happy endings for Peronism, at least not in the 1970s. Peronism was already a diverse and ideologically heterogeneous movement when it first formed in the 40s, but during Perón's time in exile, the ideological conflicts within the movement have grown all the more bitter. The Peronist movement was able to come together in the 1973 election for the purpose of returning their leader to Argentina. But Peronist unity ends with the return of Perón. As Perón's plane approaches Buenos Aires, Peronists from all sectors of the movement gather outside the Ezeiza International Airport to welcome their leader home. But snipers suddenly fire into the crowd, killing several leftist Peronists. And what was supposed to be a triumphant victory celebration instead erupts into a literal gun battle between rival factions within the Peronist movement. The Ezeiza massacre sets the tone for Perón's final presidency. Sometime in late 1973 or early 1974, members of Perón's government found the far-right death squad, the Argentine Anti-Communist Alliance, or Triple A. There is an ongoing controversy over whether Perón himself was involved in creating the Triple A. But in either case, the Triple A operated with impunity during his final presidency, and it was led and organized by high-level members of the Peronist government, including a cabinet minister and members of the federal police. The Triple A's mission is to destroy the Peronist left, by which it means not only the Montoneros, but also the Peronist youth and leftist clergymen like the liberation theologist priest Carlos Mujica, who was assassinated by the Triple A in 1974. The Triple A also assassinated dozens of leftist labor leaders in the early 70s. Meanwhile, the Montoneros continued to carry out attacks on conservative labor leaders, the police, and the military. Perón dies of natural causes just 9 months into his term, and he is succeeded by his vice president and third wife, Isabel. Under the government of Isabel Perón, the alliance between the government and far-right death squads becomes even more explicit, and groups like the Triple A transform into a para-police force that coordinates closely with the official police and military for the purpose of violently eliminating the government's enemies, most of which are fellow Peronists from the more left-wing sectors of the movement. Isabel Perón's presidency is often regarded as the starting point of Argentina's dirty war, because it is during her 2 years in office that many of the worst practices associated with the dirty war began, including mass clandestine detentions, disappearances, and extrajudicial executions. Isabel Perón is eventually overthrown in a 1976 military coup that inaugurates Argentina's last and most brutal military dictatorship. The new military regime ramps up the campaign of repression against the left that had already begun under the final 2 Peronist governments. And by the time that this regime finally falls from power in 1983, it will completely annihilate the Montoneros and systematically murder some 30,000 leftists, labor activists, journalists, and students.